Welcome back to the JumpStart Sports Show. My name is Jason Kopp, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. And we're going to talk about some Dynasty fantasy football. I know today I'm going to be a little bit of a lone wolf. I got my Giants gear on, Saquon. Hopefully he has a good year. And I know we're without my buddy Steven, but we're going to talk about one of my biggest passions, Dynasty fantasy football. We're going to just, on this part of the channel, we're going to just go into a ton of Dynasty specific content so you can be better prepared to get into your Dynasty fantasy football drafts, so you can get better prepared for your seasons. And I'm going to talk about in this episode something that, I didn't know anything before I started my first couple drafts, and I really wish I knew some of this. So hopefully for those of you who are new to it out there, those of you who are experimenting with Dynasty fantasy football, as opposed to your normal redraft leagues, this could be a really good intro for you that you can take and then, apply some of these different aspects in the actual startup drafts so that you can better dominate your leagues. Because ultimately in Dynasty fantasy football, it really starts with the startup draft. That's when you usually draft, your veterans. Sometimes people bring in rookies as well, but I'm going to go right into it. Let's jump right in. Number one, trading back. So the best part to explain of why trading back is so important, fantasy football is a guessing game for the most part. So some players smash and others regress. But what you do by trading back and picking up more assets, especially future draft capital, is it allows more flexibilities and players to take chances on. I guess a real life example of this is 2 years ago when I started playing, Christian McCaffrey was one of those picks that arguably was top three, even in superflex drafts. And before, a couple years before that, Juju was also in the top 10, right? Michael Thomas was in the top 5. And if you look at how those careers progress, obviously, there's always injuries in real football, and that's always something to take account for. But it's variability, right? Sometimes it just happens, and you can't always predict variability and injuries and stuff like that. But what you're doing when you trade back. So, for example, when I was playing one of my first Dynasty fantasy football leagues, I decided to trade out of the 1.02, which is where a lot of people historically would take Christian McCaffrey at that point in time. What I did by trading back is I accrued, I think it was like a second round pick, a fifth round pick, and maybe like an eighth round pick, as well as moving up from the 10th slot or wherever I was to the fourth pick in the rookie draft. And what that did is it allowed my team to be deeper by having those different picks. And by having that extra rookie capital, you can use that to further trade back. And it all kind of depends on what you're going for. If you're trying to be a contender, you can use that draft capital to make other trades that will help you win now. If you're trying to do a rebuild or a productive struggle, which basically means that you mortgage 1 year pretty much, but you're anticipating that in the second year you'll be competing. So guys like that, like Calvin Ridley, who's suspended this year for, his sports gambling. Next year, he might be a really high-end fantasy asset. So it's kind of like a good mix of this year, he's not really going to be anything, but in next year, who knows, right? He could be top 10 again. So number two, taking players for value. So what does value mean, right? Value is thrown around a lot in the dynasty space and honestly fantasy football space as well. And it means don't take players because they're a fit on your team. That doesn't matter. It's the same way that NFL, for the most part, NFL teams will draft best available. That's how you should approach fantasy football drafts as well. Obviously, depending on how big your league is, that will change. But for the most part, if you don't do that and you draft best player available, it'll also allow for flexibility within your roster for roster construction, because then you can trade whatever the best player available was for some spot that you really needed, and then pick up, like I said before, more assets, which ultimately will help you dominate your league for years to come. Number three, know your league mates' tendencies. what I mean by this is everyone values differently. In my home Dynasty league, they mostly do not care about the quarterback position, but a different league that I'm in does. So what does that really mean? And in knowing league mates, league mates' tendencies. For the league that doesn't care about the quarterback position, for example, having 5 quarterbacks, which usually would be really important because it's a place of strength, doesn't really matter because it's not really, you're not trading those to any of the teams because they don't value that position. In a different league, it's actually really, really hard for me to acquire a quarterback. So as a third quarterback, I have Mitchell Trubisky, which is not great, but it's really, really hard because they value the quarterback position much more strongly. So the people who have extra aren't willing to part with them as much as I am, where in one of the leagues, I have the quarterbacks. So number 4, always understand and live by this fundamental fact. Every player has a price. It doesn't matter how you view something or someone or, a player. For someone else, it might, they might not value that player on their roster. So an example of this could be Deshaun Watson. With a murky future, with all of the 24, I believe right now, allegations, for sexual misconduct. And, you can hate Deshaun Watson as a person, and he is almost definitely a absolutely garbage human being. So let me put that on the record. But looking at Dynasty fantasy football, he is a very high-end asset because when he does play, and the NFL is a horrible place, which we've discussed in this channel many times. When he does play, he's going to be considered a top 5 asset again. And so how someone else may view him, they might want to get off of him, right? They might not want to take the risk. I know one of my very close friends, after Michael Thomas got hurt last year, he was more thinking about like the win now situation. So he traded him for a 3rd round pick, which was asinine, right? But to him, the value wasn't there. So always realize that everyone has a price. And it always depends based on how you value players. Like that's ultimately what it always goes back to. Number 5, always analyze your roster. And when it gets closer to the season, that's when you really figure out if you're a contender or you're a pretender. And just make sure to sell or buy assets based on that premise. So we don't know really like how good our teams will be until you get closer to training camp, until you get closer to like the real season beginning, because there are injuries, there are suspensions, fluke things happen all the time, there are trades, and you just can't, rely on the fact of like we all are just as fantasy football players taking guesses, and you're not smarter than any other person or any other analyst that's out there. So you just have to wait. And then when you realize like closer to the season start, whether you are a contender or a rebuilding roster is probably a better word than pretender. That's when you'll know what to do. And you just need to base your roster construction off of that. Number 6. I can't count. Number 6, fantasy calculators. A lot of people use these. The more that I've played Dynasty fantasy football, the more I've realized that people are very reliant on like a keep trade cut, which basically accrues data from many people by basically giving like a survey before they enter the site. So this is good and bad. It's good because if you know that people are using calculators like this, you can use it to your advantage. So for example, like on keep trade cut, Gabriel Davis, who has yet to actually have a real breakout, is valued super, super high, as opposed to maybe someone like a Michael Thomas whose value is dipped right now, but like the second he gets back on the field, he's a wide receiver 1. So you just have to like realize that if people are using Dynasty calculators, you can absolutely use that to your advantage. The downside of fantasy calculators is that it's complete nonsense. Like it's complete nonsense. Everyone has different values. Everyone is guessing. That's the ultimate thing. Is like, yes, there are some definites. Justin Jefferson, unbelievable talent. Jamar Chase, unbelievable talent. Rashad Bateman as the wide receiver one on the Ravens, we think is going to be great, but we don't know, right? So anything can happen until the season begins. So number 7, and I really strongly live by this one. Do not try to screw over your league mates. Don't try to win trades. That's how people no longer trade with you. If you make trades that are fair to you, like you don't send out a trade that you yourself wouldn't look at and say, that is fair. That is something that I could, make sense of. If you screw over your league mates, they're not going to be willing to trade with you. Number 8. Don't overthink it. We are not as smart as NFL evaluators, right? We are all making educated guesses. We don't know that Zach Wilson, after a terrible rookie year, is going to be amazing just because they added Garrett Wilson and they added a decent offensive line and some good tight ends. We don't know that. Don't overthink it. If you see the product in front of you that's not good, just don't overthink that maybe he becomes the next Josh Allen because of the one QB sample size that we have to go off of. Number 9. There are a few things that are really indicative of how rookies will pan out specifically. Talent, situation, draft capital. Those 3 pillars are so important. You look at someone like a Najee Harris, first-round draft capital, was amazing at Alabama. Pittsburgh Steelers run the hell out of the ball. You can look at anyone in their history. Le'Veon Bell, right? They always do this. D'Angelo Williams. They just do that. So when Najee was drafted, you had to know he was going to be a bell cow. And what that means for his dynasty value is he is a huge, huge value in all rookie drafts because he will exceed that price in the next year for the dynasty startups. That's always how it works. Sometimes there are guys like Jalen Reagor who don't pan out. Like that happens. But again, you're just making educated guesses based on those 3 pillars. Talent, situation, draft capital. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but you're doing your best to get the edge on your league mates, and this is how. Number 10. Always be building. Look at Dynasty in a 3-year window. Unfortunately, a lot of leagues fold because they lose players. Other league mates lose interest. Unfortunately, that happens, and leagues fold all the time. So try to look at it in like a 3-year window. Don't just trade away all of your like 32-year-old assets, say like a Matthew Stafford, for a rookie QB who you'll have to wait 3 years for him to develop, like a Jordan Love, right? Jordan Love plus. But then you wait and you trade like 2024 draft picks for him. Like, not all leagues are actually going to make it to that year. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Number 11. Know the fundamentals. Running backs, for example, do not have a long-lasting shelf life. QBs aren't dead if they're 33. Wide receivers generally retain value the longest, and tight ends are usually pretty gross. You have like the top 3 to 4, and then usually there's a lot of variance whether you get to the 5 to 10 range and so on. And it always is changing. So just know the fundamentals, right? Running backs don't last long. Christian McCaffrey, like I said before, he was easily the number 2 pick in almost all startups, in Superflex startups, like Jonathan Taylor is now. But in a couple years, are we going to be looking at them saying maybe they're injury prone? Saquon, for example, my boy. You know, it's tough sledding out there for him right now. He went for being a also consensus top 5 pick. And now it's really hard to judge him because he had a lot of injuries and ultimately his value has declined. So know that with running backs. You know, there's always an age decline. It's just how it works. Le'Veon Bell, same way. Todd Gurley, same way. It just continues to happen. And there's actually one other one I wanted to add in here too. And it also has to do with it before. Number 12 would be just really pay attention to those draft capitals of the running backs, because almost always, and there are absolutely exceptions, if you're a round 4 or later running back, even if you succeed, almost always they get replaced. Whether it's a new regime, new coaching regime, you know, it doesn't really matter. Like James Robinson was amazing, and the next year, because he was an undrafted, rookie running back, they drafted Travis Etienne. Elijah Mitchell was amazing last year. What did they do? They draft Tyrion Davis-Price in the 3rd round this year. It just continues to happen year after year after year. Michael Carter was amazing last year for the Jets. They tried to trade up into the 1st round and get Breece Hall, and they got him in the 2nd. It's just, you watch it happen year after year, and eventually you have to look at it and be like, you know what? This is a way to get ahead of it. So, for example, guys this year like Dameon Pierce, who look to have a great opportunity for the Texans. He might and probably should start, but while his value is at its peak is when you want to get out of it, because the following year, for all we know, the Texans are going to be in a position where they want to trade and get one of these amazing running backs in the 2023 class, a Bijan Robinson. Maybe they're in a position to do that, or a Jahmyr Gibbs, or Tank Bigsby, or Zach Evans. Like there are countless guys, Zach Charbonnet, all of which could replace Dameon Pierce immediately. So always pay attention to those running backs, because generally the people who the players who have capital of round 4 and later don't usually pan out. Sell them at the peak. Keep building. And I think that's it for today's episode. But if you liked it, make sure to hit the subscribe button, send a like, a comment of how dumb my tips were. This is the first one we did with just me, and it was pretty terrifying, but I'm glad that we got through it. And I'm looking forward to keep doing, Dynasty content on this channel. I'll see you guys next time.